On behalf of the Northern Virginia Economic Development Alliance, I want to welcome everyone to this installment of our 12-part series, Beyond COVID-19, NOVA Business Resiliency Webinars. My name is Chris Bruno, and I am the Director of Economic Development for the City of Fairfax, Virginia. The NOVA EDA, comprised of the 10 founding jurisdictions, aims to promote Northern Virginia as the best place to start, grow, and locate businesses in the United States. While we feel that our region is truly the best place for business, we also realize that there exists an enormous amount of uncertainty in our region directly caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's conversation aims to answer just a few of the many questions that business owners and members of our community are asking during this unusual time. Specifically today, we will be discussing strategic planning in a digital world. 2020 has turned the world upside down for everyone. We are all accustomed to saying that weeks feel like months or even years. We're frenetically adapting to social distancing, health requirements, changing consumer spending trends, experiencing technological work from home and operational challenges, and dealing with a host of important political, familial, or societal emergencies. Why is strategic planning in a digital world so important? Before we know it, we'll find ourselves weeks or months down the road still dealing with crises as they come. And while that is adequate enough to get by, it is not enough to grow and emerge from the COVID-19 crisis stronger or more resilient than before. 2020 is providing businesses with a unique opportunity to adapt more quickly than normal. Our students have become pros at online learning, and most of us now reach first for a Zoom link before our phone. This conversation will consider how our businesses can be more innovative, smarter, and efficient while harnessing these disruptions to build back stronger. To moderate this discussion, I would like to introduce John Jacobs. John will also introduce our panelists. Again, on behalf of the NOVA EDA, welcome to Strategic Planning in a Digital World. I am very much looking forward to today's conversation. John?
Great, Chris. Thanks. That was Chris Bruno, folks you heard from. I'm John Jacobs. I'm the moderator of this series, this episode today, and then the entire series Beyond COVID-19 Business Resiliency Webinars. I will share with you now, as I do every webinar, just a quick agenda, and we'll go through that. And we'll just get kicking off with the panel here. Just give me one sec and I will share my screen, a feat of technological mastery. Just one sec, folks. Takes us just a second for our friends to catch up on the Zoom side. All right, great. So this is Beyond COVID-19. This episode is entitled Strategic Planning in the Digital World. And this is the 12th of our series, sort of a capstone moment for our series as well. You just heard from Chris Bruno. He's the director of the Office of Economic Development in the city of Fairfax in Virginia. I am John Jacobs. So we'll go through at the top here, a poll. It's a live poll. There are, I believe, 7 questions in that poll. It's very succinct, very quick answer, easy to answer poll. So I would encourage you to please all just contribute some answers to those poll questions, because we're going to use those answers as part of our discussion further on in our panel chat. I also want to let the audience know that we are taking questions. So if you mouse down to the bottom of your screen, you will find a nav bar. You'll see Q&A. Please go ahead and place any questions you might have there, and we'll get to those just after we have the panel discussion. So let me go ahead and activate that poll, if I may. Hang on, folks. And great. So you should all now be able to see a poll there. And so just go ahead and go through that. Again, it's relatively easy to see, so rather to answer. So in any case, let me just go back here for a moment. Excellent, excellent. I'll take you through this quick update. We do this every one of the webinars, and then we'll get into our discussion. I'll introduce the panelists. The first bullet, PPP loans, we've had that in here consistently since the beginning of the series. No real news change there, no updates. 7/31, we remember that the application process closed, yet there remain significant funds on account within the PPP program. I mentioned the EIDL loans. They are still accepting applications. These are not transferable to a grant status. And then I mentioned actually last week, the 3508 EZ form to help make the request to transition from a loan to a grant. Unemployment filings for the week ending 9/12 were down slightly from the prior week, down to 790,000 filings. according to the Department of Labor this morning. As we know, unemployment rates have steadily decreased over time, as you can see here, June, July, and August. I made this point for the first time last week, and I've updated a bit here. The Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which is aligned alongside the unemployment filings, have seen continued increases. This is a program rather aimed for gig workers, freelancers, part-times, who normally would not be eligible for unemployment at the state level necessarily. So that's interesting to track. And in fact, there's I think a Wall Street Journal article a couple of days ago that said there are actually more filings under this program at the moment than there are under the unemployment filings themselves. No surprise here, looking at the quarterly GDP numbers for 2020, we see 1Q, 2Q, no change there, obviously. 3Q update is that the GDP for these are forecasts, right, for the third quarter GDP are rising. So both the Federal Reserve and Atlanta they're estimating a rise from 29.3 to 32% to the positive, that is expansion. And if you look at fourth quarter, you see that sort of negligible amount of growth there, both reported by the Conference Board, and you see a stat here this morning from the New York Federal Reserve of 7.3. What's interesting, I think we are looking at the assumption is that significant growth is occurring this quarter for the entirety of the year. These are annualized numbers, by the way. Total coronavirus COVID cases as of this morning, according to Johns Hopkins University, worldwide saw actually a significant rise to 29.9 million. It's an increase of 7.4 just in a week. And that's occurring in several isolated countries from a volume perspective. US cases rose to 6.6 million, an increase of 232,689. US deaths rose to 196,885, which is an increase of 5,957 since a week ago. I put this last bullet here because it's relevant to today's conversation, and we'll get in a more expanded discussion in a moment. 76% of small business owners surveyed responded that cloud services were critical to their business survival during this COVID period. This is actually a study from the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council in Vienna, Virginia, and it was held set into the market in June of this year. We have an outstanding panel. I'm really happy to be able to have these thought leaders with us today. I'm going to just do quick introductions here. We have Shubber Ali, who is Managing Director of Digital Innovation with Accenture, Tom Stevens, Managing Director of Prescient 360 Group, LLC in Virginia, and Dave Terry, CEO of Archway Health up in the Boston area. So welcome, gentlemen, all. Thank you very much. We have the live folks here. Here they are on the panel. So now you can have a larger view of our panels. Let me just read some bios that I've edited down a bit. They're substantial bios, so I necessarily had to do that. Shubber Ali is one of Accenture's global innovation leaders, now serving as Managing Director of Digital Innovation. Prior to rejoining Accenture in 2017, Shubber was co-founder and CEO of Centric Technology. Before that, Shubber was a Vice President of Strategic Innovation at Salesforce.com, where he worked with clients to help them strategically transform their businesses by focusing on how to rethink and radically simplify business processes and models. Shubber currently serves as the board member of Mindshare, a mentorship program for DC area CEOs, and as a member of the Dean's Advisory Committee for Georgetown University's Graduate School of Business. Welcome, Shubber. Tom Stevens is the founder and managing director of Prescient 360 Group, a professional services firm providing support to companies and nonprofit organizations both in the US and overseas in the areas of strategic planning, organizational resilience, change management, and program design. Prior to forming Prescient 360, Tom was a vice president of Citizens International, based in DC, undertaking numerous consulting assignments in the areas of international economic and environmental policy, strategic planning, project management, etc. Prior to Citizens International, Tom served as an economist with the World Bank Group. David Terry, as CEO of Archway Health, Dave is a leading expert on care and risk management strategies and underwriting within value-based care programs of all types. David has been a senior executive for providers all along the care continuum. Prior to joining Archway, David served as the partner for both Partners Healthcare and Harborside Healthcare. He currently serves on the board of Bottom Line, a national education nonprofit, and is a past board member of the Harvard Business School Health Industry Alumni Association. Well, welcome all. Thank you, panelists, for being part of this discussion this afternoon. And necessarily in a linear fashion, I have to throw a question to someone. So I'm going to throw a question to Shubber Ali. And Shubber, when you think about the negative effects of COVID, the pandemic, they're increasingly clear over the past few months. Are there any positive effects as well? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, so there are positive effects in terms of the implication it has for business. Quick correction, by the way, on the bio. I have stepped off the board of Mindshare, I think about a year and a half ago. I think I did not send you the most updated one, so I just want to make sure that everybody knew that. But great organization. I was just in California. It didn't really work when I was living there. So yeah, so I think that the first thing is we probably all heard the expression digital transformation. It's been around for almost a decade now, and every company talked about it. It became buzzy, and then it kind of went away as, okay, that's old news. But the joke was nobody actually really did it. And so the pandemic is forcing a lot of companies to finally adopt the digital technology. I mean, even the fact that we're doing this kind of webinar and this is the new normal in some respects. I'll come back to that phrase in a moment. But forcing companies to finally do the digital transformation that they talked about. And the ones who are leading are the ones who are actually focusing on, what is the customer's real problem? What's really going on here? And that's where they're then innovating and coming up with new stuff. And so we're seeing a lot of great new innovations come out as a result of it. They always say, crisis creates new ideas, new opportunities, et cetera. But what at the core of it is because over the last probably 20, 30 years, longer than I've been in consulting and longer since we've been out of B school, there's been this focus on making organizations, big and small, more efficient. Everybody's driving for efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. The problem is nobody thought about resiliency. And so what ends up happening is we created this incredibly amazing system that knocks slightly out of kilter, it all falls apart. And so now you've got all these broken pieces everywhere, and companies, the ones that were leaning into it, jumped on the opportunities to reconnect things in a different way and come up with new models and new systems, and are pulling ahead of the rest. So it used to be that you could kind of be average and still kind of make it, but now it's really kind of, there's two poles. There's the ones who are getting it and doing the digital stuff and innovating to solve customers' problems. Customers can be employees as well as end consumers, and then the ones who aren't, and the ones who aren't probably won't make it through what will be another 6, 12, whatever months of this.
It's interesting. In the prep for this conversation, I think all three of you sort of got in front of me and said, because the topic is strategic planning, and there's a lot that needs to be done before you actually get to a strategic plan. And we'll touch more on that in a moment as well. But my question is, if you think about strategic planning, when I do strategic planning for organizations historically, I'm looking at my performance, my historical performance. I'm looking at inputs to production or the services that I deliver. And then I'm prognosticating forward, maybe with some, really reachy goals. But it strikes me that this period of disruption really takes away of the value of historical norms. And so the question I have to you, Shubber, is how do you do strategic planning if there are so many unknowns?
Well, honestly, that's always been the case with strategic planning. I think the fundamentals don't really change. So it has changed and it hasn't changed, which is a good economist answer, right? But like I said, the fundamentals don't change, but the day-to-day has changed. There's this thing, and I said, that phrase, the new normal. I hate phrases like new normal, post-COVID, all the rest. It's just the current reality. But what we need to remember is that this too shall pass, right? We can't operate under the assumption that we're going to be in this kind of operating environment forever, because if we are, there's much bigger fundamental changes that are going to occur across the landscape. So if we assume that we're going to get out of this, you have to do some kind of it's almost like triage planning for now, but then continue strategic planning, thinking about where the puck is going. So using the expression from Wayne Gretzky's dad, which is, you skate where the puck's going. You want to say, okay, well, and those are the same strategic planning tools we've always used. Scenario planning is a great example. It was big in the 90s, 80s and 90s, and then it kind of disappeared. I don't know why, because it's a fantastic tool where you look at multiple futures and then come up with the most resilient strategy across all of them, right?
It's interesting, Tom, you had points in our earlier discussions about resilience. And I want to ask both Tom and Shubber the same question, specifically around resilience. So Shubber, you made the point that we invest in efficiency, we invest in growth historically, but we don't really invest in resilience. Yet, so how do you put an ROI on resilience? Is it redundancy or is it just worst case scenario planning? And I asked that of Shubber, but Tom, I'd like to get your view on that.
So do you want me to go first? Or do you want Tom to go
Shubber,
first?
please, you first.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So I'll put my old Lean Six Sigma black belt hat back on for a moment, right? Which is really, that was probably one of the biggest drivers of getting to this incredibly efficient machine that we have, because anything that was not directly in adding value at the moment was considered waste, whether it was sitting in inventory or is being moved from point A to point B, all that was considered waste. And so the idea was, how do we take all that waste out? Well, inventory in a warehouse is waste in one sense because it's underutilized capital because it's just sitting there. But at the same time, it's also stockpile in case there's an emergency, like for instance, masks or our strategic petroleum reserve or whatever, you want to pick as a thing that you keep. What happened is the pendulum swung too far in one direction. And it said, let's get as most as we can toward just in time, zero inventory, all these things that sound really good and very consulting like, but at the same time, take out any capacity to flex at all should something happen. And there's a balance that will come back, which is going to say, you're going to have some of this thing, but then your forecasting tells you, well, what do you expect statistically is going to be the likelihood of you going to need so much? Then put on 10%, or whatever that thing is. But going to zero was an extreme that we're starting to find, I think, was part of what created this fragile but incredibly efficient machine.
Tom?
Yeah, let me look at that from a little bit different perspective. Is that the flip side of the coin of resiliency is, how does an organization understand disruption? So disruption can be high impact, low impact, the probability of it happening. So what COVID brought out is that was a high impact, low probability event. And so a lot of companies, organizations were not particularly ready for it. So to a certain extent, if one looks and understands where you are likely to be impacted by some sort of disruptive external, usually an external event, then you can start to identify essentially whether or not you're resilient. And resiliency is not just an either or binary thing. There's a spectrum of resiliency across a lot of business functions. And I'll mention that a little bit later.
Sure. And another question for Shubber, and I'll bring in David and
John
Tom
just likes to pick on me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And full disclosure to the audience, not only is Shubber a brilliant guy with Accenture and one of the market leaders there, he and I also attended the same grad school. But he's done much better, naturally. So sort of my question for you, Shubber, you're the managing director of digital innovation at Accenture. And most of our audience are small and mid-sized businesses. I don't know what it means to make digital investments that make sense for a small business. And how do I know it was the right investment?
So, as with many things, I hate the words digital and innovation as well, even though it's in my title, because they're used all the time and no one really agrees on what they mean, right? So I'll try to make this as plain as possible, because then I think it helps to answer the question you asked, John, which is, first off, innovation is nothing more than a new way of doing something that adds value. So it has to add value for it to be innovative, for the way we define it. So, but it doesn't have to be new to the universe, right? You can simply look at another industry and say, oh, look, they're doing this thing over here. Let's copy it in my model. And voila, innovation, right? Whether you're a small business or a large business. Great example being any sort of as a service model that we all know now, right? Whether it was Mark Benioff doing, software as a service with Salesforce in the cloud before anybody else, or it's subscribing to gym as a service on my Peloton at home. They're just as a service models. But when you do it in your industry, if you're the first one to do it, or you're the first one in your area to do it, it can be innovative. And even if it's just new for your company, but other people are doing it, then it's an innovation for you, even if it's not, these world-changing disruptors, as people like to talk about. Digital is just a set of tools that lets you do things differently. So we used to use spreadsheets. Before that, we used to use ledger books. Well, now you can use tools in the cloud to track things better. You can use online software to manage certain things. You can use tools to help manage your workforce, recruiting, training, retention, how you deploy your employees. So employees who were working in the business before, let's take a small, a small retailer or restaurant or what have you, and how do you pivot them from being working in the business, which is now shut down, into either doing curbside or delivery? Well, you can leverage digital tools to help you do that, and as a result, allow you to respond and go after a market that you weren't really serving before to adapt to the environment, right? It all starts with understanding what problem you want to solve. And there's a great quote I use all the time when I'm talking with clients, and it's if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes solving it. Because if you know the problem really, really well, the solution is usually pretty obvious. And my test whenever I see innovations out there, whether they're small or big, is if my first reaction when I see it, kind of like, well, duh, it just seems so obvious when you see it, but nobody saw it until somebody brought it to the world. That to me is like the best innovation possible, because what they did was they saw something because they looked at it at a different angle than everybody else did. So when you start looking at your customers' problems and your customers' problems, you start to understand, well, what's really going on? And this applies to small and medium-sized businesses in many respects more than large enterprises, because big companies are very bad at innovating. Small and medium enterprises are actually great at it because you're a lot more nimble. You don't have to go through layers of bureaucracy. And generally, you actually still talk to your customer, right? If you're a sole proprietor or a small business or even medium-sized, you're interfacing with the customer. There's no better way to understand what's going on in their lives and therefore what problems they have. And then say, well, how might I solve them differently?
Great, great. I'm going to just, if we could segue to Tom, if I may. As a question I actually want to aim at David later. I'm going to park it, but the word nimble really keyed me because you made that point in the prep for this. And I think, Shubber, you just hit on a really good point using that word. Tom Stevens, how are you? My first question to you is to ask you to frame the discussion in terms of kind of what Shubber just said. What's the right questions to ask? If you're a business owner, what are the right questions that they should be asking themselves? And you were kind enough to prepare just a few slides to help guide the audience. So I'm going to share that with the audience. Just give me 1 sec, and then ask you to answer that question. There you go. Can you see that?
Yep. I think this first slide, the questions, is essentially what we've already discussed. To what extent is strategic planning any different because of COVID or digital business transformation? And then the second one, if it is different, how is it different? I'm going to Shubber stole a little bit of my thunder on the second slide. And what I wanted
to just ignore he did that and go ahead.
Yeah, but I think we got to be very careful.
Sorry, Tom.
COVID bubble that we're in, that we're sort of awash in the sea of business jargon. And here's simply a list of terms that I've seen used that are thrown out quite commonly. And yet, in some ways, most of these were used well before COVID came along. So there's nothing really new about them. We just seem to have co-opted them in the COVID discussion. And then I picked up a couple of articles, about titles of articles that are in different business reviews, a couple of them from Harvard Business Review, some other ones. The first two, interestingly enough, aren't even COVID articles. They're from 1998. So essentially we're asking, as Shubber was saying, some of the same questions 20 years later that we were asking back then. So we basically always lived in a sort of an unpredictable environment where we're not really sure what the future is going to look like. So that's not anything new. The one about reimagining 2020, we had started using this reimagining term well before COVID. And then I get a chuckle out of the last one about make your organization anti-fragile. Now, it looks like somebody's just looking for some new buzzword to put in all of that wash of jargon, so that we're asking exactly the same questions and calling it something else, sort of the old wine in new bottles. So I think in the context for this is that we need to be thinking that this is not, in my view, not necessarily a new problem. And yet we're, because of what it's done to our businesses and organizations, perhaps we're focusing on it a little bit more than we have in the past. My basic premise for the points I'm going to raise is that you hear a lot of discussion about this new normal, but my argument is it's not the new normal, that sort of macroeconomic, systemic new normal that you read about in McKinsey and Harvard Business Review and elsewhere. It's really, what is your organization's new normal? How is your organization dealing with what has occurred over the last few months? For some businesses, it may not have changed in the least. Others have seen, stellar business performance. I use the example of Peloton exercise bikes, which if you ever go Google what their stock market price looks like, you will, it's just absolutely amazing. So some businesses are doing very well in this environment. Others are really hurting, as we know. So if you're in commercial office leasing business, or you do event planning, or you do travel and tourism, we've read about how they are being affected. I think, sort of, as I put here, maybe one common denominator of all of this, whether your business is doing okay or not, is that we're probably going to be looking at and re-examining about our workplace, workforce. How do we interface with our customers, and what are our customers buying? Do they want to buy what we're selling anymore? So my basic premise in this is that, is the first step in any strategic planning exercise is you need to define what your new normal looks like and how you're seeing that changing over time, even if that's a short period of time or a longer period of time. Let me see if anybody has any comments on that. Dave, maybe you're thinking along those lines. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, this is helpful. A quote I've heard a number of times recently occurred to me. You guys have probably heard this, the Dwight Eisenhower quote: "Plans are useless, but planning is essential." And I think that's relevant in today and in this conversation. Is the process of planning, I think if you do it well and at the right intervals, helps us anyway understand what our core is and what it is that we're good at, who our customers are and the problems we help solve for them, what our team is capable of, what our leadership group is capable of, how we're differentiated from our competition, what our capital position is and access to capital, and just kind of understanding all those things. And so as the environment changes around us, those things don't change, but the environment is shifting. And so, given those capabilities and what we're good at and what our market position is, how can we respond either to negative forces around us or to new opportunities? And that's really what we've tried to do here. I mean, we've certainly in 2020 are taking a hit to our top line. Certainly not going to meet the budget expectations that we had at the beginning of the year. But if we look at it from a long-term perspective, we see a tremendous amount of opportunity. And one of those opportunities or areas of opportunity is, what's core to us isn't necessarily core to some of our competitors. And we're seeing some consolidation in the markets we play in, and that's creating some acquisition opportunities as people, hunker down and focus on what they're good at, and we do the same. There's shakeup. And so, for us, it's really just kind of understanding what it is we're good at and seeing if we can leverage that in new ways as the market changes.
Great. And then, Tom, you had one more slide here. I think is your final slide. We got about this organizational.
Yeah, it got chopped up a little bit there, but the point of this is that when I think about an organization's new normal, there are really two sides of that. What's happening inside your company, and what is the business ecosystem that can cause those, and I'll say, slow-moving disruptions or fast-moving disruptions. So all of those business ecosystems in the little black box. those issues are the kinds of things can affect your business. So obviously a technology shift and threats is not a sudden onset event like COVID was, but it can be a slow moving but very impactful thing. And that's exactly, I think Dave's business is exactly trying to address that problem for the health industry by providing some new tools and ways of thinking about that. But ultimately, inside the business, there are core functions, which I listed 5 generic functions, which is, what is leadership doing? What are the operational sides of business? How does sales and marketing work? And what are the financial functions? And then somewhere in that core center there, sort of, what is the culture of the company? Is it changing? Is it being impacted by any of these events, whether they're slow moving or fast moving?
I want to just pick up on this point about this crisis, this disruption is not new. The ramifications socially from a health perspective, yes, that's new. And I had one experience. I was a COO of a nonprofit in Chicago last year, and this resonates with me, and perhaps this is helpful to the audience. This was an organization that developed everything internally, all their IT systems, all their programs, virtually everything was an internal build. Some caveats to that. We had Salesforce, for instance, but everything else, the CRM, the event management tools were homemade. And that seemed to be working, in a survivable way. It was not very efficient. And yet there was no impetus to make any change until our website was attacked and taken down. When the website was destroyed, it caused us to then look at all of our IT behavior. We didn't have the staff to rebuild everything. And it wasn't just the website. A lot of our tools were taken away from us that we had hosted out on servers. And so we were forced to make these changes. And I suspect we would never have done that had it not been for that crisis moment. But that's a very reactive way to behave. So how do you not get to that crisis point? And I asked this question, let me throw this at Shubber for 1 second, then ask Dave and Tom to jump in. Now, the idea of waiting for the crisis to occur, how do I scale the crisis that hasn't yet happened? How do I know that?
I'm not sure I follow the question exactly.
Well, so in my example, I was in a reactive position, right?
Yep.
And the management team, and we were all sort of happy with what we had. And it took that crisis to wake us up to act, but that cost us.
So yeah, the problem is on the one hand, that's not really an unknown crisis, right? Like I actually am dealing with a client right now that went through a very similar situation, and they just happened to have had us on retainer, so we were able to jump in and help them quickly start to resolve the problem. But it's more that it's a bit like Tom was saying before, it's a bit like the black swan event, right? People just don't take it seriously. No one takes seriously I'm going to get hit by lightning, so they don't really take any precautions. They walk in front of their house. And yet people get hit by lightning. People are more afraid of shark attacks than bee stings, but bee stings happen a lot more often. You don't actually personally, and this is experience like I watch my kids, they learn by stubbing their toe, and you can tell them all day long, hey, don't do that, until they do it themselves, until they touch the stove and find out it's in fact hot after it's been used. It's like academic knowledge for them. It's not real. And so at one level, unfortunately, it's almost like you have to experience that thing, or you have to have somebody whose job it is to think about risk all the time, but then not to become so risk averse that you end up being paralyzed.
Great. No, and I know that's a difficult question. It's like, how long is a piece of string? And I apologize having put that out there. Let me transition to David for a sec. David, CEO of Archway Health, just give us a 90-second elevator pitch. What is Archway Health and who do you help?
So our customers are provider organizations and employers, and our focus is to try to make healthcare simpler and help consumers and patients make better choices, wiser choices, more informed choices about the quality and value of healthcare that they receive. And so we use One of the great things about the new economy and the Affordable Care Act and other activities is it's made a tremendous amount of healthcare data available. It's unfortunately not yet easily digestible by your average consumer. And so we use that data to and technology tools to help consumers make better choices about their healthcare, and then also for folks who finance that healthcare, whether it's an employer or a health system, we help them use that data to make wiser choices as well.
You mentioned, we talked a little bit earlier about the word nimble, and David, you had mentioned this in a prep conversation. Shubber, you just brought it up, making the point, Shubber, that smaller and mid-sized companies are often more nimble and more agile than large enterprises, large corporations. Dave, what's your experience on being nimble, and is it something that just came with the territory, or did you have to behave in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I do feel like our organization is pretty nimble, and that's represented, I guess, pre-COVID in the product development cycle. So our ability to create new products and bring them to market. We operate in a MVP, minimally viable product environment, and so we're creating new products and tools, bringing them to market, testing them. Some of them work great, some of them don't work great, and that's okay. We're learning along the way, and we build on what we're learning and just kind of keep going from there. And those capabilities and that culture, I think, has helped us through this COVID situation where we've had pretty number of different cycles we've gone through in the history of our company, and this is just another one of those cycles, and the team seems to have responded in a pretty resilient way.
The point you made about core business activities, non-core, that's really, I think it's pretty fascinating. So just to recap that, you're making the point that you had competitors in your space where that function related to your business was not core to theirs. This has helped sort of shake out the carpet in the set for a moment, and then you get a new set of competitors, but you also get opportunity through acquisition or partnering, merging, whatever the behavior is. Does that change your? Well, my first question is, are you sticking to your core? Are you fully aligned? Do you feel like you're fully aligned in your business on your core?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a good test, and sometimes staff will ask questions, or why are we doing that? Does that fit with who we are, or what we're doing? Which is always good conversations. But we try to stick with what we think we're good at, and why people join the company in the first place. But from a market perspective, we, like everybody, we know our competitors pretty well. We know. We have a handful of customers who are diversified businesses who are in a variety of different business lines. The segment that we compete with is sort of certainly from the outside looking in anyway, tangential to their main businesses. And so we've been pretty proactive in reaching out to those companies to see if there's an opportunity to either acquire or potentially partner with them in various ways, because we're segments of the space that we're in, we're committed to for the long haul. And the COVID situation has, I think, caused folks to really reflect on what they are committed to for the long haul, what their long-term opportunities are, and that's created opportunities for us to grow, and also I think opportunities for folks we reach out to realize value for something that they may not be committed to for the long term.
Yeah, just ask you on the strategic planning front. You're a CEO of a company, and when you look at doing strategic planning, is it sort of a very formulated process, or is it inspired? And how much has the disruption of COVID made you course correct a little bit?
Yeah, I would say it's relatively formal process that we do pretty much every year. We have we have a company retreat once a year, and we talk about kind of what we're doing, new products we may have developed, markets we're pursuing. We have a senior management retreat every year where we kind of build on refine the strategy and those types of things. So it may not be as formal as what large companies do who hire Shubber and a firm like his, but from a team perspective, we certainly are reflecting on kind of where we are and where we're headed, I would say roughly annually.
And for
Yeah.
Tom and Shubert, both of you are in strategic consulting. And I'm curious, if you were advising a company, not necessarily Dave's company, but
Please do. We need all the help we can get.
uh, but and you cover this a bit in your slides, Tom. But what's sort of the early conversation you would have with the client if they're looking at developing a strategic plan? And strategic plans, in my mind, are usually 5 to 7 year windows. Would you agree with that? First off, are those long windows, or is that highly variable? The length of a strategic plan window.
I think it could be 2 years to 5 years, maybe even farther out. But let me ask Trevor and Dave a question, whether they would agree or disagree with this in terms of a strategic plan based on their experience. I would argue that a strategic plan is not a business plan. It's not an operating plan. It's not a vision or mission statement. And it's not a marketing plan or sales or marketing plan. So it's got to be something where you've got a lot of moving parts in a company that has to respond to a changing business environment and identifying what that is. And so a strategic plan without execution, and I'm sure, Trevor, you face this, and Dave, you're facing it right now. If you can't execute it, then it's not really a strategic plan. It's just a piece of paper that's been discussed and agreed at the the management retreat. So I think the danger is usually that you develop a strategic plan and then you stop. And so again, the old devil is in the details about, well, if you've got one and you have an alignment and agreement, consensus within the company that reaches all the way down throughout the company, how do you implement it? And that's ultimately the test. The litmus test is the implementation, the execution.
So I think that's spot on. What I would add is, I don't know if the people who are watching or part of this webinar right now haven't seen, there's a TED Talk by Simon Sinek that goes back, it was actually a TEDx talk to I think about 2006, 2007 on the golden circle. He ended up building a whole consultancy around it, wrote a book around it, but he talks about the why of an organization. And I'd say actually, even before a strategic plan is a clear why of the organization, which most don't frankly have, big or small. But once you have that, strategic planning as an exercise is useful to look, whether it's 2, 5, or 7 years out. It's really more to say, where are things moving on kind of a tectonic level? And then how am I best positioned to respond to that? What do I want to go after in the near term? And then you have to put together an operating plan, a sales plan, whatever else you want to do with that. Two things that I caution against is, having also had small companies, I've built multiple companies as well as doing the big corporate end of the world. And in the small companies, when we're doing them, there was not an annual planning retreat. It was a real-time, ongoing, living thing, because you were in the business day to day. And so you had to adapt a lot more quickly, which is why I say companies can be more nimble and innovative at the smaller end, because they can react to signals more quickly. They don't have to have 15 levels of management meetings after they hear something from a customer and it's been filtered 97 different ways before it ever gets to that, and they can do something with it. And when we talk even with big clients about this, we say, look, strategy dictates where you're going to innovate, but what you're learning through your innovation process informs your strategy, and it's a cycle, right? Because based on what you're learning out there, it changes maybe where you want to go with what you're doing in the company, and say, we should really be focusing on this. But we're not going to wait a year to figure that out. If you just had your strategic planning meeting and then you learn something 2 months later, are you really going to wait 10 more months before you think about it again? No, you shouldn't, right? So I don't think it should be that structured. The other part is, I was on the board of a not-for-profit that I remember when I joined them, they were really proud, and they gave me their strategic, their strategic plan, and it had 21 strategic priorities. And I just stopped and I said, look, you can't possibly have 21 priorities by definition. So that's your first thing you should fix.
That's awesome. So I'm going to talk to the audience for a sec, folks. We're going to close that poll that we launched at the top of this program. So if you haven't, please do take just a few moments and fill out those questions. There are 7 questions, very quick to answer. And I'm going to go ahead and just close it out now. Hang on one sec. And I have the results here. And I'm always a bit uncertain with Zoom if the audience can see the poll, but I hope so. If not, I'm just going to read briefly through it. And panelists, you should be able to see this poll, I believe.
I can see it.
Awesome. So let me just go ahead and read through, and then As I do, ask the panel to please opine a bit on these. I'll just read through the list rather quickly. The first question we asked the audience was, basically, has your business been disrupted by the COVID pandemic? 95% of respondents said yes to that question. Number two was, well, looing, which also means looking back, if you don't hit the K, which I did not, looking back, how prepared was your business to be disrupted by something like COVID-19? Not well prepared, 55% of respondents, 41% responded somewhat prepared. The third question was, how far in advance are you currently able to plan your business? 3 to 6 months was the largest response group, 41%. I'm going to come back on that. I find that, I guess I'm not surprised, but I find it a little worrying, is my thought on that. I'm just going to, question 4 was, which areas of your business have been negatively impacted due to COVID disruption? This is a multiple choice question. Give me a second here. The number 1 answer was most impacted negatively with customer engagement. Number 2 was employee management. And interesting, closing sales was number 3. Question 5 was, in what ways has your business been benefited during this period of disruption? And the number 1 answer group was no benefit. Okay, and that was not a cheeky question, folks. I was just trying to get to the flip side of the previous question. Then the next group is reduced costs. Not surprising, either through PPP or just through staff reduction or whatever it might be. And question 6, are you developing a new strategic plan to improve business resiliency as a result of this disruptive COVID-19 experience? Yes, is a resounding answer. 2 months ago, I asked that question and it was 25% yes. Now it's 86% yes. That's interesting. Number 7, last question. Will your business be better off or worse off in 12 months due in part to the COVID-19 disruption? 55% major answer is I don't know. And then yes and no were in the same ballpark. So those were your responses. And I'd like to get some views from the panel. Does anything jump out from at these from the 3 of you?
And one thing that I guess I would, in reacting to question number 7, will your business be better off in 12 months? And I think this is related to the question earlier. You were concerned about kind of the 3 to 6 month planning cycle. The next 12 months is really hard, right? I mean, yesterday the CDC leader came out and said it's going to be 12 months before we have a vaccine. The president said, no, it's not. I mean, who knows, right? But if you look out 3 years, you got to believe we're going to be back to normal in 3 years. And, or back to a resilient, relatively normal economy. Certainly elements of the economy will be different, but we're going to be back to normal in, 3 years or so. So, if for us, if you ask the question, will you be better off in 12 months? I would say, I don't know. But in 3 years, I think we're going to be a lot better off. And I think it comes back to what we're doing now to, think about, what our core is and what opportunities are created through, doubling down on that core and then how the market is changing around us. And the fact that, we have a pretty resilient economy. When we come out of this, we'll be back. And so, the way we think about it, I guess, is the 3-year horizon here. And what are the opportunities that are created now that position you well in 3 years? And I think the stock market is basically saying the same thing, right? I mean, stock market seems irrationally high given everything that's around us, but I think what they're saying is, look, this is a temporary blip.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I think that the real question to ask yourself is, and I was kind of keying off the very first question on there because it says, has your business been disrupted? So most people said yes, but then 40% of people said they were somewhat prepared. I'm like, they were somewhat prepared and yet they were still disrupted. So I'm kind of curious to the disconnect there, because I'm wondering then, what do we mean by disruption? Because if you then look at your own business, and I don't know the distribution of the 30 plus participants here as to what kind of business they are in, small and medium, but if you just took your own business and you look forward 12, 24, 36 months and said, is my business going to still be here? Meaning, is the thing I do right now actually a necessary thing, or is the market fundamentally going to change as a result of this, such that I need to think differently about what we're even doing? Because there are companies that are pivoting left and right, trying to say, well, what else can I do instead? And that then opens up the question to say, maybe it's not about how do I keep doing what I'm doing? And even maybe how do I digitize what I'm doing? But really step back and saying, what else could I do given the things I have in the equivalent of my tool shed or my pantry or whatever, given the problems that are out there, which is why I go back to focusing on the problems of the customers. And they may not even be your existing customers, and I mentioned this to the panel when we were talking offline beforehand, I believe, but Jeff Bezos famously, I had an interview that I read of his from 11 years ago. This is long before the Amazon of today, where he said, most companies focus on what am I good at? What else can I do with that? And he said, we focus on who are customers, not even who are our existing customers, but who are customers and what problems do they have? And then do we have anything that can help solve that? And if not, let's build it or let's buy it or whatever, if we think that the problem is worth solving. And it allows them to go into totally different areas and just never stop growing. And now they're like in 16 different industries because it starts with a very different philosophy. And so I would just say, it doesn't matter if you're big or small. And everybody says, oh, but they're Amazon. Well, they were once just like everybody else, but they always started with this philosophy. So there's a real power in doing it that way.
The other element of that is they have a really, really long-term view. Right?
Yes.
So solving these problems and solving them incrementally over a long period of time.
Yes.
Which I think differentiates them as well.
Which is the same as Jack Ma at Alibaba and the rest was the same thing. Let's think longer term and let's understand this, what is the signal we're really looking for in the customer problem. And if you look around, I know like we have our kids who are at home, we have to do virtual learning. There's a whole bunch of things that did to our work environment and the rest. In every one of those problems, there's a bunch of people who have the same problem, which means there's an opportunity to be solved.
Right.
Tom, did you want to jump in?
I was going to say that if you look at sort of the trends of those first three questions, it goes back to that business article I quoted about the COVID two-step, protect and pivot, which at this point, I think some of that reaction, being prepared, not prepared, is not a strategic planning issue up front. It's essentially protecting the business and using the time and whatever new tools and ways of thinking allow you to look for that strategic plan to put in place. But perhaps, for the short-term window is not really a strategic planning window. It might start the process, but essentially protecting and hoping you survive if you really have been impacted. Let's say it's the car rental business, or we were talking about hotels the other day and what they're doing with the empty rooms, as opposed to giving them to clients who are staying there, turning them over into essentially places where people can essentially recover and be sequestered from COVID. Whatever it is, some of those are beginning the process of strategic planning, but they're not necessarily strategic planning.
Hotels in Boston have become dorm rooms.
Yep, exactly.
They don't want doubles anymore, so there's single dorm rooms.
Yeah, we're talking about hotels as well becoming essentially offices for people who simply can't work at home because they have broadband, they've got a desk, and they've got, in some cases, even like a refrigerator, whatever else, depending on the setup.
But that's a short-term answer or a medium-term answer. It doesn't answer the question that Dave was saying, well, once you get over this, once we see some light at the end of the tunnel, then what does the hotel industry do if it's still not going to recover to where it was pre-COVID?
Right, and that's a great question. Well, from a planning perspective, do I make hay? Am I nimble and smart, and do I make hay of the moment? But is that really a plan, or that's just opportunism? Right, that's the point, Tom, that you're making is this is done. Are they turning, the Cambridge Marriott into a dorm? Probably not. Which gets to the other point, and Shelby, you made this point about Amazon. Is your point, look at the things that you do well and apply it to new scenarios and new customer sets, perhaps. So
no, that's exactly the opposite. It was exactly
Okay.
the opposite. It's the look at the customer sets around you and then say, do I have anything that allows me to enter that space, or is it completely greenfield for me, right? But if you've got anything, you can just use as a jumping off point. Because what happens if you start with what am I good at, who else can I serve? You then limit it to literally only those, oh, well, I can't do that because I'm missing this piece, or I can't do it, I'm missing that piece. If you start instead with, well, what is their problem? How could I solve it? Then you start and you should know what you're capable of, what your core competencies or whatever buzzword you want to use are in your pantry. And then say, okay, but do I think that opportunity is big enough to go after? Well, if I don't have that competency, I need to build it, or I need to buy it, or some combination thereof, because I think the market for self-service grocery stores is big enough that it's worth getting into this, right? Is in the case of like Amazon Go stores, right? It didn't
Right.
start because they said, well, hey, we can deliver books, so let's open a grocery store. It
Right.
started with,
And we remember that Amazon did start as an online book company,
yeah,
distribution play.
yeah, and sometimes you still buy books from them, right?
Yes, but it's as a nominal behavior, right?
Right.
That's fascinating. I'm going to just pull the rest of the slides up. And folks, I will include the presentation and will be posted on the Nova EDA website. I just want to go back here and share with you. These are 2 points, and you'll see hyperlinks on the on this PowerPoint. Tom Stevens, who is on board on this panel, recently had an article with SmartBrief, strategically building the new normal for your organization, and new normal, quotations around that as well. I thought it was rather compelling write-up and helped sort of open the thinking. And then Accenture, known for producing some reports and analyses and insights, has gone ahead and created a sort of a micro website. And I realize I may not be sharing this. Can you folks see the further reading?
I don't see any slides, but
Oh,
that might
okay.
just be me.
I apologize. I just want to share the title so folks can take a picture of that, because I think it is useful for folks to have that access.
And maybe just put the link to it in the to the page in the window, in
Right,
the chat
right.
window.
Well, I'll do that, but that would require my fingers to do all this typing stuff. But the Accenture has the COVID-19, this industry impact of coronavirus, and they have numerous reports, analyses, interviews there. And again, strategically building a new normal for your organization by Tom, and that's in Smart Briefs, and those are links there. Final points, final question to all three of you. Optimistic that we're coming out of this, that small and mid-sized companies are coming out of this at some point maybe more robust than they went into it, or are we feeling sort of the jury is still out on that?
I'll go last.
Okay, well then we'll pick on David then, because you run about a 50-person organization. You seem optimistic that you're going to come out the other side of this just fine.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about our future and where we're headed. I think our focus is to make healthcare simpler, more affordable, and as we enter into a recession here, I think there'll be more pressure on that from the federal government and individual employers and state governments and things, and just consumers wanting and needing to find more value and simpler process in their healthcare. So I think that's, while this whole event is obviously awful for our country and many people in our country and the economy, I think long term certainly it creates opportunities. I think in general, I was just reading an article before we got on here that, many smaller businesses like restaurants and gyms and salons and things like that have closed and aren't coming back. And so I think it's, 20-25% of those businesses in some markets. And so obviously it's, terrible for those folks and challenging for those industries. But I do think it creates opportunities for folks who are resilient and nimble and have the wherewithal and the resources to come out the other side. So I think certainly for folks who are looking forward and being proactive, there's a ton of opportunity in the next 18 to 36 months.
Tom?
Okay, well, let me waffle the answer. That's always useful as a consultant in it. But I think it really depends on the industry or the sector you're in. And some will see a quicker return to sort of whatever normal is or the new normal. I think others, there was some McKinsey analysis showing that some industries will probably not recover till 2025, which doesn't sound like what we want to hear. And then let me reiterate in answering that, I think for some companies, it's again some of the slow moving disruptions that could be more lethal to your business because you don't see them coming, because it's sort of the old Persian proverb, death by 1,000 cuts, that you miss the little things that which should be appearing on your radar screen, but they're just not. And that is unrelated to COVID, but it is essentially an issue which could be happening during and as we recover from this COVID era.
Trevor.
Yeah. So first off, I agree with Dave said. I mean, you have to be optimistic, especially if you're a small business. I mean, just by very definition, otherwise you never would have gotten into it, right? So then at the core of it, that's a key part of what gets you going and drives you every day. And as a former entrepreneur, I know that. But and Tom is right. It does depend on industry. Some industries, I look around and I see certain businesses and industries are doing just fine. It's like nothing ever happened. In fact, they're busier than they were before. I think about people in like the construction segment, the housing segment, things like that. Contractors in some cases, it's very hard to get someone to do work because they're so busy. At the same time, people need to remember, and especially people on this call, is that SME is the lifeblood and the engine of the U.S. economy. We like to talk about the Fortune 500 or the Global 2000, and yeah, they're big, right? The big companies, but the vast majority of the economy is actually still all of the small businesses that keep everything going. And the sad reality is that you can have your specific number with it, but I've heard anywhere between 70 and 80% regularly fail for a whole range of reasons, cash flow and a bunch of other things that drive the failure of small businesses. But yet it keeps going. So while yes, there will be failures, there will be shutdowns and the rest, and it's terrible that they happen, I see them repopulating as the economy starts to pick up again. This is my fourth recession we're going into right now. I remember the first one before we went to grad school. And then, there's the dot-com crash in 9/11. And then there was the global financial, depression, recession, whatever you want to call it, that happened 12 years ago. And, we just came out of that one. And now we've got another one, right? They seem to happen about every 10 years. And then it bounces back. But Tom's also right, because that death by 1,000 cuts, we're still in the early days, my belief, again, I'm not speaking for the firm here, of this traffic jam, car pileup, whatever you want to call it, of what's happened, because a lot of the impacts to different industries that support the primary industries that have already been impacted are just now starting to cascade through the system. So for instance, I work in the aerospace sector, and the big manufacturers, obviously Airbus and Boeing, have been shutting down, furloughing people and the rest, but their customers, the airlines, have been now delaying orders and canceling orders because they can't even fly the planes they have, which means you don't need the new planes, which means now the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers, including that guy or that gal in a small tool shop in some small town who makes widgets that go into one part of a wing flap, all of a sudden all those orders are going to disappear, and it's going to take its way as it cascades through the system. And until they find something to pick up that slack, there's going to be a problem. And so if your business, if your small or medium-sized business is dependent on those kinds of things, think through, again, who your customers are, what their problems are, and your customers' customers and what their problems are. Not just, consumer facing, but now if you're B2B, and say, am I at risk because something can happen to them that will disrupt me, even though I don't directly would think I'm at risk? That's really important.
Great point to end on. I want to thank this panel for coming together. I think the audience got a lot of great, very useful information and perspective here. I also want to just let the audience know that this actually, the 12th in the series, was the end of the series. However, the good folks of Nova EDA are interested in continuing the series. I haven't yet figured out what that is, but we will. And I appreciate you all joining and tuning in. Again, this webinar, its related documents will be posted on novaeda.org under events. And then you can look at the compendium of previous webinars in this series. Thanks, panel. Thanks, audience. Have a great afternoon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.